A genial climate and suitable grounds. These were the requirements established by Wilbur Wright in February 1910 as he began a tour of the southeastern United States to select a site to establish a spring training camp for student aviators. Now, for Wright, a genial climate meant an area having mild weather conditions and moderate temperatures. Remember that the early flying machines offered no protection from the elements. The frigid temperatures of Ohio made operations from their home field near Dayton an extremely uncomfortable, if not dangerous, endeavor. A genial climate also meant an area having satisfactory surface winds. The underpowered Wright flyer needed the assistance of a light wind to help lift the machine into the air. Too much wind, however, made the craft too unstable in the hands of novice aviators. A second, equally important characteristic sought by Wilbur Wright was what he considered to be suitable grounds for flying. His flying machine needed an area of level terrain with no obstructions. Because the flyer would be operated at an average altitude of 50 to 100 feet when training student aviators, even small trees posed a hazard to the machine. Now, before we begin our discussion of Wilbur Wright's journey to Montgomery, let's take a moment to look back at how these remarkable brothers recognized the need to train a group of young men to operate their extraordinary invention. Some historical text would have us believe that Orville and Wilbur Wright were the first humans to achieve flight. In fact, they were not. During their early trials, the Wrights depended heavily upon data obtained from other early aerial experimenters, notably Otto Lilienthal, a German engineer who had previously made more than 2,000 successful glides from a hilltop near his home in Berlin. What the Wrights achieved at Kitty Hawk on December 17, 1903 was very specific. Orville Wright would later describe that historic flight as the first time in the history of the world in which a machine that carried a man had raised itself by its own power into the air in full flight, had sailed forward without a reduction of speed, and had finally landed at a point as high as that from which it had started. Essentially, this was the first powered, controlled, and sustained flight of a heavier-than-air machine. Although this event represented a remarkable technological achievement, the 1903 Wright Flyer was not in any sense a practical airplane. The 1903 design was only marginally controllable and barely able to sustain itself in forward flight. In fact, Orville Wright's first flight that day lasted a mere 12 seconds and covered a distance of just 120 feet, about the length of the hallway outside. Following their success at Kitty Hawk, the brothers returned to Ohio and established a flying field at Huffman Prairie near their home in Dayton to conduct additional experiments. For the next 2 years, the Wrights devoted their efforts to perfecting their invention so that by 1905, the machine was capable of remaining aloft for more than 1 hour, flying in complete circles and figures of 8. This 1905 machine is considered to be the world's first practical airplane. Upon reaching this milestone, the Wright brothers made an interesting and, in hindsight, questionable decision. They stopped flying. For almost 3 years, neither brother went aloft, choosing instead to invest their time to secure patents to protect the rights to their invention. This quest would ultimately consume the life of Wilbur Wright until his death in 1912 at the age of 45. During the years of the Wrights' aerial sabbatical, other experimenters began developing flying machines of their own, sometimes utilizing the Wright design and at other times creating new and improved technologies. Although these patent disputes would not be resolved until being deemed in the national interest following American intervention in the First World War, Orville and Wilbur Wright soon realized that competition from other designers not only had a negative impact on the sale of their flying machines, but more important, that their design was actually becoming obsolete. Reluctantly, the Wrights decided to organize an aerial exhibition business to demonstrate the superiority of their design and to promote the sale of Wright flying machines. The brothers made the decision to train a team of aviators to travel throughout the country to promote their product. These aviators would attempt to set new aviation records, earn prize money, and fly for a fee at aeronautical exhibitions, county fairs, and other large public gatherings. They would also be qualified to provide instruction to those the Wrights referred to as society sportsmen who purchased Wright machines. Because of the harsh winter weather conditions in Ohio, the brothers decided to establish a camp in the southeastern United States to take advantage of good flying weather to train the initial group of aviators for the Wright Exhibition Company. During his tour, Wilbur Wright visited sites in Augusta and Atlanta, Georgia, as well as locations in Florida, but had been unable to locate a site that met his requirements. During one of his stops, an acquaintance suggested that he try Montgomery, Alabama, an area known for mild weather conditions and flat farmland. On February 15, 1910, Wilbur Wright arrived at Union Station in Montgomery, and in doing so, ushered in the first century of powered flight in Alabama. Wright first made his way to the Commercial Club, a predecessor to the city's Chamber of Commerce. There, he had a chance meeting with the group's president, Fred S. Ball. Upon learning of the purpose of Wright's visit to the city, Ball immediately formed a committee to escort Mr. Wright to various locations in and around the city of Montgomery, including the State Fairgrounds and the Montgomery Country Club. Now, although none of these initial sites proved to be acceptable for various reasons, Wright quickly realized that the area around Montgomery had enough flat, treeless land to suit his needs. The following day, Montgomery businessman Frank D. Cohen read an article in the Montgomery Advertiser announcing the famous aviator's presence in the city and the purpose of his visit. Cohen sent a message to Wright stating that he had a parcel of land 3 miles square that he believed would please the aviator. The field was located 3 miles west of the city on the Washington Ferry Road. When Wright was taken to view the field, he inspected nearly every inch of the property in typical fashion and declared it one of the best flying fields he had ever seen. In an effort to ensure that Wright selected Montgomery as the site of their training camp, Cohen offered Wright use of the land without charge for a matter of 2 months at least. The Montgomery Advertiser noted that Mr. Cohen, having the capital city's best interest at heart, did not consider the possible damage that may be done to his planted acres by the crowds that will go out to see the flying machine. Now, while we will never know how much influence their flying field at Huffman Prairie near Dayton had on their selection of the Montgomery site, there are a number of interesting similarities. First, both sites were similar in size, consisting of approximately 100 acres in area. Both were located on major thoroughfares, the Dayton-Springfield Pike in Ohio and the Washington Ferry Road in Montgomery. Both fields were adjacent to rail transportation, the Dayton, Springfield, and Urbana Railway in Ohio, and interestingly enough, the Mobile and Ohio Railroad in Montgomery. Characteristic of the Wright brothers, both fields were isolated enough to allow a degree of seclusion. The establishment of the Wright Flying School in March 1910 led a reporter for the Montgomery Advertiser to exclaim, "The eyes of the entire nation, if not the world, will be fastened upon the city." Montgomery business owners pledged to make the Wrights' visit so profitable as well as pleasant that the aviators would wish to make the training camp a permanent institution. It is easy to understand why the Montgomery business community was so aggressive in their efforts to secure the Wright School When we consider that during his stay in Montgomery, Wilbur Wright received approximately 30 telegrams from business leaders in other southern cities, offering even greater enticements to lure the school away from Montgomery. In addition to providing free accommodations for Wright and his students at the New Exchange Hotel in Montgomery, as well as transportation to and from the flying field, local merchants donated materials and labor to construct the first aeroplane shed in Alabama. Located adjacent to the 3-mile post on Washington Ferry Road, the aeroplane shed was constructed by the D.F. Gordy & Son Lumber Company of Montgomery. To ensure the building would be ready for the arrival of the flying machine, the structure was completed in less than 1 week. As you'll see, Montgomery merchants were quick to realize the potential commercial advantages of being associated with the Wright School. Local clothier Weber and Johnson proclaimed that our prices, like Wilbur, are right, but they are not up in the air. And as you can see, other merchants adorned the building with advertisements of their own. The Montgomery Advertiser proclaimed a strange new bird soared over the cotton fields to the west of Montgomery Saturday afternoon, as Orville Wright made the first flight of an airplane over Alabama on March 26, 1910. Wright made 2 flights that day, each lasting approximately 5 minutes in duration and achieving an altitude of 50 feet. Since the flights had not been scheduled to begin until the following week, only a handful of people were on hand to witness this historic event. So few were in attendance that the reporter for the Montgomery Advertiser was able to include the names of each of the 8 spectators in his news coverage of the event. The machine used in Montgomery was the same as that flown by Wilbur Wright in New York City in 1909 at the Hudson-Fulton celebration. On this flight, Wright took off from Governor's Island, navigated over the Hudson River, circled the Statue of Liberty and Grant's Tomb, and returned for landing. This flight is considered to be the first extended overwater flight in the United States and was witnessed by more than 1 million residents of that city. An interesting side note, because he was over water, he tied a canoe between the skids just in case he had to land. Although Wilbur Wright initially indicated that both he and his brother would run the flying school, Orville Wright assumed responsibility for operation of the Montgomery training camp, and the brothers were never in Montgomery at the same time. Many spectators felt that Wright and his students appeared to be dressed more for a church service than for flying. Weather conditions permitting, the school operated daily except Sunday, the day set aside for observance of the Sabbath and for rest. Because Orville and Wilbur Wright had been raised in an environment of strong moral values, aviators of the Wright Exhibition Company were forbidden from drinking alcohol, gambling, or flying on Sunday. Normally, the flyer was launched by means of a launch rail and a weighted catapult system to help accelerate the machine to flying speed. And you can see that Walter Brookings, one of the students, is sitting on the launch rail here. But because the Cohen property allowed plenty of room for the flyer to build up speed on takeoff, the weighted catapult system was not utilized in Montgomery. For me, one of the most remarkable characteristics of the Wright brothers was their ability to solve complex problems with simple solutions. And remember that they were starting at ground zero on virtually everything. For example, the Wright flying machine had 2 propellers driven by a single motor. And you can note one of the propellers here, and there's one of you can actually see it up top here. If these propellers rotated in the same direction, aerodynamic forces produced by the propellers would make the machine even more unstable and difficult to control. Instead of attempting to design a complicated mechanical solution to this problem, the Wrights simply twisted one of the propeller drive chains to achieve the same result. And you can see this twist in the tubes here. A simple but very effective solution to a complex aerodynamic problem. Now, in looking at this image, have you noticed anything of importance that seems to be missing from the flying machine? I'll give you a hint. When you fly on a commercial airliner, remember the safety briefing, please keep your seat belts fastened securely around you? You'll note that these early flying machines had no seat belts or restraint system of any kind. Keep in mind also that the undercarriage of the Wright flyer consisted of skids, not wheels. This tended to result occasionally in rather sudden stops, making a restraint system to me seem pretty important. These type of seat backs that you see here have been referred to as tombstone seats. Like you, I'm not sure if that solely refers to the shape of the seat or as a comment on the state of flying machines in 1910. This image reminds me of a story related by student Walter Brookings regarding a typical mechanical event that occurred during one of these early flights in Montgomery. According to Brookings, the airplane we used in Montgomery had been flown quite a few hours. On one of our first flights, the chain that operated the wing warp control broke, and we were without lateral control. But Orville, by his clever handling of the plane, avoiding a turn, and going straight ahead, landed us safely just about 10 feet from a barbed wire fence. Now, this chain was just ordinary bathtub chain, and the constant moving back and forth over the leading edge of the wing had weakened it and caused it to break. Right then, we increased the safety of flying by replacing the bathtub chain with bicycle chain. Now, I've often wondered if the Wrights issued a recall notice to owners of other Wright machines to require them to make this important safety improvement. Operation of the flyer was extremely maintenance intensive. In this image, student aviator Spencer Crane lubricates the chain drive mechanism of the flyer. If you have ever ridden a bicycle after oiling the chain, I'm sure you can imagine how the aviators looked even after a brief flight. And looking at this image, it also becomes apparent that passenger comfort was not a priority. You'll notice the location of the right passenger seat here, just at 2 feet from the heat and noise of the engine and a tank full of flammable fuel. Note also the very aerodynamic design of the airplane's radiator. In addition to being trained to operate the flyer, students at the Wright School learned to maintain and repair the machine. The wing structure was covered in a muslin fabric. This covering would easily tear when operating in tall weeds, and in this case cotton stalks, so repairs were frequently required. The propellers were produced by hand in the Wright shop in Dayton and measured 8 feet from tip to tip. I'd also like to point out the tongue and groove construction of the floor of the hangar as well as the walls, a requirement of Wilbur Wright to keep rain off the flyer. This is one of my favorite images of the Wrights period in Montgomery because it demonstrates the progress in transportation in such a short period. Spectators utilized various means of transportation to travel to the flying field. Some traveled by foot, some traveled by horseback, some in horse-drawn carriage, and some in the horseless carriage. Ironically, a conflict soon arose between the oldest and newest forms of transportation technology, as the horse and the airplane could not peacefully coexist at the flying field. It became necessary for spectators to leave their horses on the Washington Ferry Road because the noise of the airplane motor spooked them, creating the potential for damage to the flying machine and injury to the spectators. You'll also note, you can just see the front of the white steamer 6-cylinder automobile that was provided to the Wrights by a local dealer at no cost. A chauffeur was also available upon request. Finally, the Mobile and Ohio Railroad offered shuttle service from Union Station in Montgomery. 4 round trips were operated each day, the fare 25 cents. On May 5th, 1910, 970 spectators took advantage of the shuttle service to the field. The following day, the Montgomery Advertiser reported it was estimated that there were nearly 3,000 people at the training camp today to watch the aerial flights. We should also note the newest form of transportation in the airplane shed is the flying machine. When Wilbur Wright first came to Montgomery seeking a site for the training camp, he indicated that a dual purpose of the school would be to conduct further air work. In Montgomery, Orville Wright made a significant modification to the flyer by installing a horizontal plane at the rear of the machine to improve stability and simplify handling of the machine in the air. And this is the plane that we're discussing. Wright's flight of March 26th in Montgomery was the first time this arrangement had been tested on one of their machines. This modification would become standard arrangement on future Wright designs and form the basis for the conventional airplane of today. The flying machine brought to Montgomery was a Wright Model A. Subsequent Wright designs included the new horizontal plane, wheels, and other improvements and were designated the Wright Model B. Consequently, the machine used in Montgomery was an interim machine that is designated the Wright Model AB or Montgomery Transitional. When flying solo, aviators used the left seat to offset the weight of the engine. See, the pilot would normally sit here and the engine is on the opposite side. The pitch, or nose up and down, was controlled by a lever to the left of the pilot. And you can see aviator Arch Hoxsey has that lever in his left hand. The wing warp and rudder control used for turning the machine was located between the two, and the pilot typically operated that with the right hand. Because of this arrangement, these aviators were known as right-hand aviators. The instructor would sit on the right side of the aircraft and operate the wing warp control with the left hand. Instead of being referred to as an instructor, these individuals were known as left-hand aviators. Walter Brookings, that you see here with a bow tie, was a longtime friend of the Wrights and became the first aviator to learn to fly in Alabama. Brookings was also trained as a left-hand flyer qualified to teach other students. Once qualified, Orville placed him in charge of the school, and I think for a minute that Brookings had a total of about 2 hours of flying time when he soloed, and now he's an instructor. This made Walter Brookings the first specifically trained flight instructor in Alabama and possibly the United States. Brookings and Archibald Hoxsey, who Brookings has appeared with Arch Hoxsey here, also completed one of the first true night flights in aviation history while in Montgomery on May 25, 1910, in an attempt to take advantage of calm winds that would create better flying conditions. The duo conducted 10 to 15 flights that night, each lasting approximately 20 minutes in duration. In a poetic description of the event, a reporter for the Montgomery Advertiser wrote, "Not a cloud in the sky and not a breeze was stirring. The weather was ideal. The moon, shining big and full, gave full view of the aeroplane, whose dark bulk throbbed through the air. The statical explosions of the gasoline engine marked by tiny sparks. Now and then, the exhaust would scatter a trail of sparks behind the aeroplane in its rapid flight in midair." The exhibition business proved to be financially lucrative for the Wright team. For example, in October 1910, Wright team member Philip Parmalee was contracted to appear at the Alabama State Fair in Birmingham. For the 6-day contract, the Wrights were compensated $4,000 plus expenses, a hefty sum in 1910. Now, Arch Hoxsey would become the first pilot to fly a United States president, this after he had been flying a total of about 2 months. He would also set numerous aviation records during his brief career as an exhibition pilot. He would also die in a Wright machine before the end of the year. Although the exhibition business was very profitable, the flying proved to be so hazardous that 5 of the original 9 Wright exhibition pilots would be fatally injured in Wright machines within 2 years. Because of the number of team members killed in accidents, the Wrights decided to abandon exhibition flying in 1911. In her book, Wings of Opportunity, The Wright Brothers in Montgomery, Alabama, author Julie Williams suggests the Montgomery business community recognized the flying school of the Wright brothers as an opportunity to change the negative image of the Civil War South and to promote the city of Montgomery as a forward-thinking, progressive location for the establishment of business enterprise. This 1912 postcard appears to promote the same concept. Note again the different forms of transportation. We have people walking. We have an individual on horseback. We have horse-drawn carriages. We have the horseless carriage. We have the rails of the city's electric trolley system, the lightning route. And ladies and gentlemen, we have the aeroplane. I would add that this is a very accurate depiction of the Wright machine that flew at Montgomery, although it was never operated over the city. By May 1910, good flying weather had returned to Ohio in the Midwest. In the words of the Montgomery Advertiser, with the coming of summer, Wright's aeroplane, like all other birds, will fly northward. At the end of May 1910, the Wrights closed their school in Montgomery and returned to their flying field at Huffman Prairie near Dayton. The Wright flyer used in Montgomery was crated and shipped directly to Indianapolis, Indiana, in preparation for the first aerial demonstration of the Wright exhibition team. Today, the sole reminder of the 100-acre cotton field that once was the site of the nation's first civilian flying school is a modest stone marker located on the grounds of Maxwell Air Force Base. With his departure from Montgomery, Orville Wright hinted that Montgomery could become a permanent flying center. Wright's words would prove to be prophetic. Less than 1 decade later, the same factors that brought the Wright brothers to Montgomery, a genial climate and suitable grounds, would provide the foundation for the establishment of military aviation in the city. In 1917, Orville Wright stated, "When my brother and I built the first man-carrying flying machine, we thought that we were introducing into the world an invention which would make further wars practically impossible." It is ironic that Orville Wright made this statement at approximately the same time Army inspectors were in Montgomery seeking a suitable location to establish a training field for military aviators. Less than a decade after the Wright Flying School closed, the aviation section of the United States Signal Corps established an aviation and engine repair depot on the same parcel of land used by the Wright brothers. You can see that Washington Ferry Road has been rerouted to accommodate an expanded flying field, yet you can still see the old dirt road that formerly led to the aeroplane shed. In the years preceding the Second World War, the former site of the nation's first civilian flying school had evolved into a system of continuing education for officers of Army aviation, the Air Corps Tactical School. Graduates of the Tactical School assumed positions of leadership that would lead the Allied forces to achieve aerial supremacy during the Second World War. In fact, of the 320 general officers on active duty at the end of the Second World War, 261 were graduates of the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field. During the Second World War, so many pilots, navigators, and bombardiers received training at Maxwell Field that the cadets were fond of saying, "The road to Tokyo leads through Maxwell Field." During the war, more than 100,000 aviation cadets received training at Maxwell Field alone. During this period, the skies over Montgomery were described as having the densest air traffic in the world. In less than 4 decades, the skies over Montgomery had evolved from the single flying machine of the Wright brothers over the cotton fields west of the city into formations of the most advanced military aircraft in history. For more than 90 years, the parcel of land used by the Wright brothers has been dedicated to aviation and aerospace education. Today, Maxwell Air Force Base is home to Air University, the Center for Development of Aerospace Doctrine, and more than 30 professional military schools. In March 1910, the promise of a genial climate and suitable grounds brought the Wright brothers and the nation's first civilian flying school to Montgomery. More important than the climate or terrain, they discovered a city deeply committed in its support of aviation. More than any other factor, this level of commitment will ensure the legacy of aviation in Montgomery and the state of Alabama during the second century of powered flight. Thank you. I think we might have just a few moments for questions if there are some, and we're going to bring a mic to you.
What was the horsepower of the Wright flyer, and what kind of wood was used in the propeller?
Spruce, and the horsepower was approximately 35. And if you think about it, a lot of lawn tractors today have a similar horsepower rating. So they started out in Kitty Hawk with much less than that, but engine technology was the biggest challenge that they faced. Something that produced enough power, but yet was still light enough for the machine to lift itself in the air.
It seems that the Wright Flying School only stayed here from March.
Yes, so it was
only
just
3 months or so.
It was a little over 2 months that the school was actually in operation, and a couple things that's been debated somewhat back and forth. One of the biggest challenges they had was the logistics of it. That their shop was in Dayton, and every time they had an engine problem or some other mechanical issue that they needed to fabricate parts, it had to go back to Dayton. And so that would slow their process down several days. And I think ultimately they just decided that it was logistically, when warm weather came back to the Midwest, that it was easier to move back there and have everything close by.
What period of time elapsed between the time the Wrights left and Maxwell Air Base was founded?
The Wrights left in 1910, and the site for Maxwell was selected in late 1917, so 7 years. And Maxwell was dedicated in April of 1918, so less than a decade.
Billy, the throttle control, was it fixed throttle, fixed RPM?
No throttle. Once they cranked it,
that was
that was it. It was gone.
How long did it take them to learn to have an adjustable throttle? Do you remember? No?
The Wrights were really interesting that they only really built one airplane after the Model A, and that was the Model B. Of course, Wilbur died in 1912, and Orville never really seemed to be that enthusiastic after Wilbur's death. So I think, I can't actually answer your question specifically, but I think it was probably other designers, Glenn Curtis possibly, and some of the others that integrated the throttle. But you know, as far as would have been World War I before that even became an issue, because they had the old interrupter switches that they actually shut the engine off to land. It was not variable power. Yes.
I was curious about the students. How were they selected, and were any of the students from the local area or the South?
We had first the students. The initial ones seemed to be associated with the Wrights before they came here. For example, Walter Brookings, a longtime friend who had helped in the bicycle shop. There were a couple that knew the Wrights in Ohio. Then there were some others that came from other places and paid $250 for the training. But there were some people in Montgomery, although they were never trained as aviators, they did get flights in the flyer. Frank D. Cohen being one of those. Yeah. In fact, Walter Brookings died. I'm sorry. The question was, did any of the students lead normal lives after the? I guess it's yeah. 5 were out of the 9. Walter Brookings survived to an old age, is buried in California, and it seems to be the key is those who eventually walked away pretty quick. Yeah, just left, and because when you mix adrenaline and young age and this new technology, and which was still evolving, it's a recipe for problems. So.
Tell us about Taylor Field out at Pike Road. When was it in operation, and how did it compare with Maxwell while it was in operation?
What was so interesting to me about Taylor Field, and if you don't know, Taylor Field was established as one of 14 primary training fields in the United States to train military aviators for service overseas for the First World War. Army inspectors came and found a site for Taylor, and interestingly enough, Maxwell was constructed because of Taylor Field. It supported Taylor and 5 other training sites in the southeast, West Point, Mississippi being one in Tennessee and a couple in Florida and one in Georgia. So Maxwell actually supported Taylor Field, and it was interesting to me that Maxwell survived and Taylor didn't, but Taylor was actually constructed beginning in November 1917 in the Pike Road community southeast of town, and it was an 800-acre site, had 400 airplanes, and it was a huge facility. And one thing that's interesting about Taylor Field, they had all the modern conveniences, indoor plumbing, and all of this stuff when the surrounding areas didn't. And you can go out there to the site today where they're developing some of that and see some of the old plumbing that's coming out of the ground. And it was a very modern facility, swimming pool. But it only lasted about a year. Of course, the war ended and the military shut down all of those fields pretty quickly.
What were some of the more interesting patent fights that the Wrights had? You mentioned their concentration on that early on.
The one was control, their system of control. The Wrights' position was that anything that related to an airplane went back to control in the air. Consequently, any improvements made to the airplane, they were covered by that patent. And that's why those issues lasted so long. And as I mentioned, it was not until the First World War that the United States needed unabated access to that technology, and it was deemed essentially in the national interest to do that, because I don't think the courts could have ever resolved it. Now, one thing that's interesting, while the Wrights were focused on that, Glenn Curtiss and others were making huge technological improvements, and especially in Europe. And so the Wrights' technology actually became outdated while they were trying to resolve these patent issues. But it was, the singular one was control in the air, system of control.
Billy, just a footnote on the students. You mentioned Arch Hoxsey and Walter Brookins. The third student who soloed, Art Welch, was the first Jewish American pilot.
Oh, really?
And in 1911, he taught Hap Arnold how to fly.
Wow. Yeah.
Do the audience a favor and describe wing warping. That's an issue that that changed into the new ailerons and so forth. Would you, so they'd understand?
I'll do my best. The Wrights, there were really 2 secrets to being able to achieve what the Wrights achieved at Kitty Hawk. One was control in the air, being able to make the airplane go where they wanted it to go. And the other was developing a source of power that was light enough, yet powerful enough to maintain forward flight. Now, wing warping. What the Wrights did, if you saw some of the images, and if I can find one real quick, you'll see that they had just a remarkable amount of rigging on these airplanes. And to the control, wing warp control, it ran cables out to the wings. And if they wanted to make a turn, they would move the control over, and it would actually pull the trailing edge of the wing down. Let me find what I'm looking for here. You can see that just the myriad of bracing wires and cable. I defy you to walk along that wing. You just couldn't do it. But when the control was moved, it would actually pull down the trailing edge of the upper wing surface. And when it does that, it increases the area of the wing and generates additional lift. Now, one of the problems they had was when they did that, the airplane wanted to turn in all different directions. And so that's when they put a rudder control on the airplane as well. They were not the ones that invented the aileron. And that kind of gets back to what we were talking about. They effectively quit experimenting with this 1905 machine. They made some further improvements, but not many. And the aileron, and George helped me with this, was actually designed in Europe, or Glenn Curtis had a big influence in it. And so the Wrights never really moved away from this wing warp design, and technology basically left the Wrights in a sense. And of course, with Wilbur's passing, Orville just seems to have lost his enthusiasm for pursuing the flying machine or further improvements.
Yes, you mentioned the comment about making war impossible in 1917. What did he base that on? It just seems like a really strange observation.
Well, think about the technology of what they knew at the time. And what the Wrights' position was that they felt that the airplane would provide such a surveillance advantage that no armies could ever outflank or sneak up on you. You would always know where they are, and there would just be no benefit to armed warfare. That was what they were looking at. From an aerial view, you always knew what the opponent was doing, so there would be a zero net gain.
So the surveillance not...
I don't think they ever envisioned the airplane being a technology of warfare. I really don't think that ever entered his mind. And I've seen some interesting pictures of Orville during the Second World War with President Roosevelt inspecting some of the new aircraft at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. What he must have thought. I just can't even envision it.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
If the flight were on the beach and the takeoff point and the landing point were at the same altitude, what is the reason that all of the museum and monuments and things at Kill Devil Hills are way up on the hill?
I think we as humans like to look up at monuments. Wright's first attempt was actually made from that dune. They tried to accelerate the airplane down a dune, and it just didn't work. And what they ultimately tried to achieve is to say the airplane could lift itself from a level point, fly a distance, and then land at a point at least as high. And that way, it separated it from controlled glides. This was a powered flight. Why they put the dune there, again, I just think it's human nature to want to have something up high, and that was what, when we think of the Wrights, we think of Kill Devil Hill and Kitty Hawk. And so I think it had no other bearing other than that. Yes, sir.
I'm aware of the notoriety the Wright brothers received, but did the Wright brothers become wealthy because of this?
Extremely so. Extremely so. They were very smart. They were very frugal, and they did not spend money unwisely. And initially, they, if you look back at their former lives, they were always doing something. They were working with producing newspapers in the bicycle shop and all this. They had a knack for making money. But initially, they made a lot of money off the patents for their aircraft. In fact, at one period of time, the aircraft that was flying in Montgomery, the Wright Flyer was the only legally operated airplane in the United States. Everybody else was operating, Curtiss and others, against the patents that the Wrights had enforced. And so they made quite a bit of money. And as I said, the exhibition business, they made quite a bit of money until they just couldn't stomach the loss of life.
One more question.
Yes, sir.
You had a photograph of the aircraft flying over the intersection of downtown. I don't live here, so I
Yeah,
don't
the
know what you
postcard?
call that.
Yes, sir.
Was that an authentic photograph, or was that made up?
That's a great, I think you'd compare it to Photoshop today. The airplane never flew over downtown that I'm aware of. And George, I don't think they ever left much that area west of Montgomery. So I think probably what happened, and I'm not an expert obviously on how postcards were produced back then, but they may have taken a picture of Montgomery, did the artwork, and then just superimposed the flyer over it. But I think it sent a pretty strong message, and that's the only postcard I've ever seen of Montgomery with that flyer included.
They came here 7 years after Kitty Hawk. What was the reaction of Montgomery? They were famous, of course. A lot of excitement.
Well, the interesting thing about that Wilbur Wright literally comes into town unannounced. He comes into town unannounced and works his way over to the commercial club. Now, once people found out he was here, absolutely. But there was a lot of trouble initially. The Wrights were very private individuals, and they did not trust newspaper writers at all. And let me rephrase that. But so it was kind of subdued, but Orville was a little more outgoing than Wilbur, and so they almost took the Wrights in as their own. But when made the point earlier that on one day, 3,000 people went out to watch this airplane fly, and there were no police. I mean, the crowds were well behaved. They complied with what the Wrights had requested them to do. They kept their distance. And so, in a sense, Montgomery took the Wrights as their own. And it was pretty heartbreaking for the city when they left.
A few years ago, a few well-meaning people tried to build a replica of the Wright Flyer. To my knowledge, it never flew. With all of our technology, was there ever an explanation why it never flew?
Well, I'll better you one than that. We are working with a project to bring a Wright Brothers Maxwell Field Museum to Montgomery. And one of the centerpiece exhibits of that museum will be a reproduction of this very airplane, and it will fly. We discussed earlier, not with me, but it will fly. So these, I don't think we today fully appreciate what a technological achievement this was. When you take 35 horsepower and try to propel that machine with all the drag and other problems with it through the air, even in Montgomery, the airplane was still doing things they didn't quite understand. And so it was a learning process, and my hat's off to those guys for launching into that and being catapulted off that launch rail and into the vast unknown, literally.
The person who was supposed to fly was Professor Langley. Did he ever do it, and what happened to him after the Wright brothers did their thing?
Well, that gets to the centerpiece of the entire debate, is Professor Langley. Because remember, I described what the Wright brothers did. Glenn Curtiss, in an attempt to vacate the patent disputes, took Professor Langley's aerodrome, that he called it, made some modifications, and then flew it. But the issue was that it did not fly prior to those modifications. Now, it was pulled, the aerodrome obviously was pulled out of the Potomac River, and for those of you that may not know, it was launched from a ship, and he was supported by the Smithsonian Institution to try to create a flying machine. The Wrights did everything on their own. They had no outside financial help. It was stored at the Smithsonian Institution until Glenn Curtiss got it and made some changes, and I can only assume, I don't know, that it is created in a warehouse somewhere in Washington, D.C. But I kind of lost track of it. George, you might know, but I lost track of it after Curtiss made some changes to it in an attempt to prove it would fly. He kind of went into obscurity not too long after that. Of course, he was, got to be careful how I say this, he was a young 60-ish at the time, and so he was kind of reaching the point ending his civil service career anyway. And so that was the last of his aeronautical endeavors, let me say it that way.
We have time for one more question. It's right here.
I'm a repeat questioner.
Yes, sir.
What the gentleman said a minute ago reminded me, what is the difference between Kill Devil Hills, where all of the replica museums and Kitty Hawk?
Kill Devil Hill, in a sense, is part of Kitty Hawk. That is the, if you will, landmark for Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The Wrights actually weren't at Kitty Hawk when they were flying. There was a life-saving station at Kitty Hawk and 2 or 3 houses, and they were actually a couple miles down the beach, but that's the closest geographical point to where they were. Kill Devil Hill is where they did the majority of their experiments prior to 1903. Remember, they conducted thousands of unpowered glides trying to perfect this control system, and they would literally launch off Kill Devil Hill to gain the momentum to glide down to the bottom. And then they'd drag it right back up and do it again. So Kill Devil Hill is a big part of the history prior to the 1903 flight. The 1903 flight essentially took place at the base of Kill Devil Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Singleton. Our speaker will be here for a few minutes if you would like to talk with him or if you would like for him to autograph your book. And we certainly appreciate you coming today.
It's a pleasure.